So I have a baking analogy for you that I think might help make things clear. So in a standards-based grading system, you look at the standard. And in this analogy, the standard is follow a recipe to bake and frost cupcakes, not from a box. Okay? So that's the standard. Follow a recipe, bake and frost cupcakes. Everybody got it? Okay. So how do we measure success? Well, the first thing we do is we figure out if a kid meets the standard, what does it look like? Well, in this case, meeting the standard, mastering the standard, they baked cupcakes and they created frosting from the recipe. Does that seem reasonable? I think so. They did not need help. They were able to do it independently. And the cupcakes and the frosting were tasty, right? Because that's an important part of being able to follow a recipe. So they were able to do that successfully. So here we go. We've got our mastered the standard cupcake, all right? So what does it look like if you're not quite there? If you're not quite there, if you're making steady progress toward the standard, but you're not there yet, you baked the cupcakes and you created frosting. You needed help with some of the steps. So you needed some coaching along the way. Maybe you weren't sure how to use the measuring cup or the measuring spoons. You needed some help. The cupcakes were fine, but the frosting was not quite fine. Or vice versa, right? So here's our 2 cupcake. It's not quite what our 3 cupcake, but they did produce something, right? We needed a little bit of help, but not quite there. So what does it look like if you're making limited progress to the standards? In that case, you needed help on many of the steps. You needed a lot of support. And even with support, the cupcakes were burnt, or they were underbaked, or they didn't taste good. Maybe you forgot to add something, right? You mistook the salt for the sugar, that kind of thing. So not so successful, right? They didn't come out of the pan so well. Then there's a 4th category. The 4th category we're calling deep command, and I want you to know that we made a conscious choice not to call it a 4. And I'm going to explain why in a couple minutes, but let's talk about what a deep command looks like first. So a deep command is a student who took the recipe and used it to make a cake. Took the cupcake recipe, made a cake. Modified the frosting recipe to create fondant, and then created shapes to decorate the cake. And the student was able to adjust the baking time so the cake was baked perfectly, right? Different baking time for cupcakes versus a cake. So the student was able to apply knowledge to do that. So a deep command is something that's really different, that shows that they deeply understand the concept of the ingredients and the recipe. Notice that a deep command, this is why we didn't call it a 4, it's not putting sprinkles on the cupcake. Does that make sense? So it's not prettying it up. It's doing something that's deeper, that shows that you have a different level of understanding than mastering that standard. And that's an important distinction. So at some point, will we move to a 4? Maybe. Right now, while we're all learning this, we kind of want you to have to think like, what is that deep command thing again? We want to draw your attention to it because we want you to understand that if your child did earn a deep command, they've gone beyond the standard, truly beyond the standard. Sticking with that analogy, let's talk about a couple of things. So homework is practice. Homework is following recipes, is learning how to use, well, instruction is probably learning how to use the measuring cups and finding out why I need to put salt in a recipe, in a baking recipe, why I need to use a certain amount of flour, right? So but the homework is just practice parts, baking cupcakes, frosting cupcakes. But there are too many variables to use it to measure mastery. And that makes sense, right? Because you don't know if the kid brings in the next morning cupcakes that her mom made, right? I mean, that totally could happen. So there's a lot of variables there. You don't know how much help they had in practicing. Group projects are also practice, especially at RVCS. Teachers use group practice a lot because it's a way that kids can coach each other and that they can help each other on this practice of the standard. But again, too many variables to use group activities and group projects to measure mastery. And then there's no penalties or reward for behavior. Now, let me clarify that. There are no academic penalties for behavior. If a student didn't wear gloves when they were, or an apron when they were baking the cupcakes, we didn't take points away. We can deal with that separately. That's a behavior, or we call those attributes for success, and I'll talk about those more. And we're not going to give them more points for bringing in baking supplies, because it doesn't have anything to do with their learning, right? So not wearing gloves or not wearing an apron, that might be a behavior we have to deal with hygiene in the kitchen, but we're going to deal with that separately than their academic mark, whether they mastered the standard, which had nothing to do with gloves and had to do with following a recipe.